Hello. This is the Treasure on the Common, and you are cordially invited to leave the noise of the world outside for a while, to come sit with me beneath the Rowan Tree and enjoy a cup of tea. There's no hurry here, no expectation, only a story, a quiet path, and perhaps a thought or two to carry with you. There are drawers that hold little more than elastic bands, old receipts, keys to locks that no longer exist, and pencils worn down to their final inch. Then there are drawers that quietly wait half a lifetime before deciding to tell their story. Nell Rowan discovered the difference quite by accident. It was almost 3 months after Edith Proust's funeral. The Lavender Ladies had met often enough since then, sharing tea, memories and more. They shed a few tears, but nobody had yet found the courage to empty Edith's writing desk. Somehow, it still felt as though Edith might return from making the tea, glance over her spectacles and quietly point out that everyone was putting everything back in the wrong place. So the desk had remained untouched until now. The cottage was unusually peaceful. A blackbird sang somewhere beyond the kitchen window. The old mantel clock ticked with steady confidence. The kettle murmured softly, as though unwilling to interrupt the silence. Nell opened the first drawer. Bundles of letters tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. The second, small notebooks filled with Edith's unmistakable handwriting. Carefully observed tea leaves. Weather notes, odd happenings in the village, reminders to ask Mrs. Turner about her rheumatism, observations about birds returning earlier than expected. Every page sounded like Edith. Observant, patient, thoughtful. Yet Nell found herself smiling, for a woman who knew almost everything about everybody else, Edith had revealed remarkably little about herself. Nobody knew whether she'd ever expected to marry. No one knew who she might once have loved. No one knew why she never spoke about her younger years. She had listened to thousands of stories, yet had somehow managed to keep her own almost entirely to herself. "Still keeping your secrets," Nell whispered. The last drawer refused to open. She tugged it gently. Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. Finally, it surrendered with the reluctant sigh only old furniture seems capable of doing. Inside there appeared to be very little. A sprig of dried lavender, 2 drawing pins touched with rust, a loose button, a bus ticket so faded its destination had long since disappeared. Nothing remarkable. Nell was about to close the drawer when something white caught her eye. Tucked into the back corner, almost hidden behind the drawer itself, lay a tiny folded square of paper, no larger than a postage stamp. She reached in carefully. The paper felt brittle, old, handled very little. It had not been kept for frequent reading, it had simply waited. She unfolded it, only 4 lines. "Now, if he's still there, go and see Arthur. He never understood what he was collecting, nor did I. Edith Prouse. Nell read it once, then again. Arthur Atkins? She had not heard the name spoken in years. Everybody knew Arthur, or rather everybody believed that they knew Arthur. People spoke about him the way villagers speak about old buildings or forgotten lanes, always there, slightly peculiar, entirely harmless. His house is full. He never throws anything away. He's got boxes everywhere. I heard you can hardly walk through the place. The descriptions differed only slightly. The conclusion never did. Arthur collected things. Yet Edith had written something entirely different. He never understood what he was collecting, nor did I. Nell folded the paper once, very carefully. It wasn't part of one of Edith's investigations. It wasn't filed away with Lavender Lady's notes. It wasn't evidence, and it was personal. Perhaps the most personal thing Edith had left behind. Not because it revealed some dramatic secret, simply because it revealed that Arthur had quietly mattered to her. Enough for her to leave one final request. Go and see him. Not go and help him. Not go and solve something. Simply go. 3 days later, with the notes safely tucked inside her cardigan pocket, Nell crossed the common. The common stretched for miles. Bracken grew taller than children. Silver birches shimmered in the morning breeze, while ancient oaks stood watch over ponds hidden inside forgotten clearings. The narrow paths wandered through the landscape without seeming to lead anywhere in particular, as though generations of walkers had trusted their feet more than any destination. Everybody knew the common. Nobody owned it. Long before maps marked footpaths, ordinary people had depended upon it. The poor gathered firewood there. They grazed sheep and cattle there. They cut bracken for bedding, and children built dens there. Sweethearts wandered there. Old men walked quietly with their thoughts. Dogs discovered every muddy pond. The common had belonged to everyone because it belonged to no one. It remembered every footstep. It forgot nobody. Nell slowed her pace. Edith had once told her that every village had 2 histories. One written in books, and the one carried quietly by the people who lived there. The second was almost always more interesting. Beyond the familiar tracks, the trees thickened and the lane narrowed. At the very end stood Arthur Atkins' cottage. It looked as though it had grown there, not built upon the common, accepted by it. The gate hung slightly crooked. Honeysuckle climbed happily over one side. A robin sat on the gatepost, as though keeping watch. Then came a voice. "No, that won't do." Pause. Another voice, or rather, the same voice answering itself. "I know perfectly well it won't do." Nell rounded the corner. Arthur Atkins was arguing with a wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow appeared entirely unmoved by the discussion. Arthur looked up. He wasn't what the village gossip had prepared her for. Tall, slim, silver hair neatly combed, handlebar moustache, cream shirt and a brown cardigan, polished shoes, kind eyes. The sort of gentleman who looked as though he apologised if he bumped into furniture. He studied Nell for several moments and then smiled. Well, good morning. I wondered when Edith would send somebody. Nell stopped walking. You did? Arthur nodded as though this were perfectly ordinary. She said she would. When? Oh... He thought carefully. 15 years ago. Nell stared. The trouble with Edith, he continued, was that she always seemed to know next Tuesday before the rest of us had finished this Thursday. He rested both hands on the wheelbarrow. I assumed she'd eventually be right. Nell couldn't help smiling. You knew about the note. I knew Edith, he said, and shrugged gently. That's rather different. He opened the cottage door. Come inside. The villagers called it Arthur's collection. The moment Nell stepped inside, she realised they were both right and entirely wrong. There were boxes, certainly. Shelves lined every wall. Old trunks, drawers, books, lanterns, walking sticks, biscuit tins, photographs, clocks. More cupboards than seemed entirely necessary, yet nothing looked neglected. Nothing appeared forgotten. Visitors saw clutter. Arthur clearly saw something else. He noticed Nell looking around. They usually decide within 10 seconds. Decide what? Whether they're standing in a collector's house, he smiled, or a hoarder's. And which is it? Arthur looked genuinely puzzled. I never thought to ask. He disappeared into the kitchen. Tea? As long as I'm not interrupting your disagreement with the wheelbarrow, Nell said. Arthur laughed. Oh, that's already settled. It is? It won. He returned a few moments later, carrying 2 mugs. As he handed one to Nell, he looked around the room with obvious affection. Then, with complete sincerity, he said, I have been wondering why on earth Edith Prowse has sent Nell Rowan to interfere with perfectly good piles of belongings. His eyes rested fondly on a stack of carefully balanced boxes that have only been waiting there since 1957. He smiled, hardly any time at all. Nell laughed, so suddenly she almost spilt her tea. And without either of them quite realising it, Edith's little folded note had just opened the first drawer of a story that had been quietly waiting for more than half a century. The following Tuesday became the first of many. Neither of them planned it, it simply happened. On Tuesday mornings, Arthur seemed to put the kettle on a little earlier. On Tuesday mornings, Nell found herself choosing the footpath across the common, almost without thinking. Before long, the rhythm settled comfortably between them. Tea first, conversation afterwards. The boxes could wait. Arthur never hurried them. You know, he said one morning as they sat watching a pair of swallows dart beneath the cottage eaves, people assume opening the box is the difficult part. It isn't? Oh, no, he smiled into his tea. The difficult part is deciding what belongs there. He looked toward the shelves surrounding them. That applies to far more than cupboards. Nell nodded quietly. She understood exactly what he meant. One damp Tuesday, Arthur carried through an old biscuit tin decorated with faded roses. A thought we'd open this today. What is it? I've absolutely no idea. You don't know? Arthur chuckled. Of course I know. He winked. I simply thought that sounded more mysterious. Inside lay a curious assortment. A bus conductor's badge, 3 theatre programmes, a baby's first shoe, an old dance card, 2 ticket stubs, a folded photograph, a tiny carved wooden bird. Nothing matched. Everything belonged. Nell picked up the photograph. A young couple stood beside the bicycle, laughing at something outside the frame. No names, no date, no writing. Who are they? Arthur smiled. Tom and Elsie Walker. How do you know? I was there. You were? Nell said. I took the photograph, Arthur replied. Nell turned it over. There isn't anything written on it. It didn't need to be. Arthur's eyes softened as he replied. I've carried their names for 60 years. He looked out of the window. Some memories never asked to be written down. As the weeks passed, Nell noticed something remarkable. Arthur never introduced an object first. He introduced a person. The object merely followed. The old lantern wasn't a lantern. It was George Henshaw, who walked home every winter evening from the station, carrying it through the fog. A cracked teacup wasn't a teacup. It was Mary Pritchard, who insisted tea tasted better from imperfect china. The broken watch wasn't broken. It was Albert Morse, the blacksmith, who carried it for 20 years because, as Arthur said with a grin, it reminded him that there wasn't much point in rushing. Every story began with a person, never with a possession. One afternoon, Nell finally asked Art. The nickname had arrived naturally. Everybody in the village called him Art. Nobody seemed quite certain when Arthur had disappeared. Did people always call you Art? Nell asked. Arthur laughed. Since I was about 12. Why? No idea. You never asked. I expect someone thought Arthur was too long, he smiled. Villages shorten everything, eventually. Nell looked slowly around the room. At the shelves, the photographs, the careful order hidden inside what everyone else called chaos. You know, Arthur looked up. I think it suits you. Does it? I don't think you've spent your life collecting, she said. No. I think you've spent your life creating something. Arthur looked genuinely puzzled. I never painted. No, she smiled. But you've practiced another kind of art. He said nothing. The thoughts seemed to stay with him, though. Word travelled quickly through the village. It always did. By the middle of the summer, everyone had heard that Arthur was beginning very gently to let a few things find new homes. The stories grew with every retelling. Apparently there were priceless antiques hidden beneath the stairs. Apparently Arthur possessed Roman coins. Apparently somebody had discovered a First World War medal worth thousands. Apparently there was a secret room. Arthur listened to all of this with quiet amusement. I've often wondered, he said. What? Nell asked. How rumours managed to travel faster than facts. Nell laughed. They've had more practice. Eventually, they agreed to place a handful of tables beneath the apple tree. Arthur refused to call it a sale. It sounds as though everything's ending. What would you call it? He thought for a long while and then smiled. A conversation. A conversation? Between people. And the objects? They merely introduce everybody. Nell decided that was exactly the right decision. The first visitor through the gate was Mrs. Collins. Mrs. Collins approached every table with enthusiasm of someone convinced treasure has been hidden behind or beneath ordinary things. Within 5 minutes, every carefully arranged display looked wonderfully untidy. Arthur quietly followed behind her, straightening, replacing, and smiling. Mrs. Collins eventually held up an old enamel jug. "It's chipped," she said. Arthur nodded. "It is." "Well, then you should probably throw it away." Arthur smiled kindly. "Perhaps." He paused. "But not before somebody hears its story." Mrs. Collins laughed. "Everything has a story with you, doesn't it?" Arthur looked at the jug. "I found most things do," he said. She bought it anyway. As she left, Nell noticed something curious. Mrs. Collins wasn't smiling because she'd found a bargain. She was smiling because she'd heard about Emily Carter, who had carried that jug to every village fete for nearly 30 years. The chip had happened when she'd laughed so hard she dropped it. Suddenly the chip wasn't damaged. It was part of the story. Arthur watched Mrs. Collins disappear down the lane. "There you are." "What?" Nell asked. The jug knew it was ready. "You believe that?" she said. Arthur smiled. "No." He thought for a moment, although his eyes twinkled. "Sometimes I think the stories do." The next visitor arrived carrying a magnifying glass. Arthur noticed it before the gentleman reached the gate. "Ah, what?" "The expert. You know him." "I know the type." The gentleman introduced himself as Mr. Peters, a retired auctioneer from the neighbouring town. He was perfectly pleasant, perfectly polite, and within moments had been turning over china, examining silver marks and peering beneath clocks. "Interesting," he murmured. "Late Victorian. Machine made. Oh. Worth perhaps £30. Arthur nodded cheerfully after each announcement. He neither agreed nor disagreed. Eventually Mr. Peters picked up an old railway lantern. He polished the glass with his handkerchief. "Good condition," he nodded approvingly. £35, perhaps 40. Arthur smiled. "It belonged to George Henshaw." Mr. Peters paused. "I beg your pardon?" "He carried it every evening for 37 years. Arthur looked at the lantern gently. When the fog came down across the common, you could always tell George was nearly home. He smiled at the memory. "My wife used to say she could see his lantern long before she could see George." Mr. Peters looked at the lantern differently. Arthur continued. "When George died, his daughter couldn't bear to throw it away." "So you bought it?" Arthur looked surprised. "Oh, no." "Then how did you get it?" "She asked if I'd look after it until it was ready to move on." He smiled. "So I did." Mr. Peters nodded slowly. For the first time that morning, he wasn't looking at a lantern, he was looking at George. When he eventually bought it, he carried it with both hands, not because it was fragile, because the story now belonged with it. After he'd gone, Nell smiled. "You just sold him George Henshaw," she said. Arthur chuckled. The lantern came free. By midday, the garden had begun to fill. Not with customers, with characters. There was young Hannah, who bought an old rolling pin because it reminded her of baking with her grandmother. And there was little Ben, who spent 20 minutes fascinated by a brass compass. "Does it still work?" he said. Arthur crouched beside him. "It always has." "Were you an explorer?" Arthur laughed. "A little." "I'm going to be one." Arthur placed the compass next to the little boy and then placed it into his hand. "I thought perhaps you might," his mother protested. "Oh, we couldn't possibly." Arthur shook his head. "It has already found where it belongs." Ben looked at the compass as though someone had handed him the North Pole itself. Now suspected that, to him, they had. Late that afternoon, a lady arrived wearing a smart hat and carrying far more loneliness than shopping bags. She wandered slowly from table to table, not really looking, not really choosing. Arthur poured another cup of tea before she even asked. "You remembered?" she said. "I did," said Arthur. She smiled. "My Harold always said nobody made tea like you." Arthur looked towards the empty chair beside her. "I remember Harold." "So do I," she said. They spoke for nearly an hour about nothing in particular. The weather, village fates, the old bus service, how quickly children grew. When she finally rose to leave, she bought a single china cup, not because she needed one, because she spent an afternoon feeling remembered. As she disappeared down the lane, Nell said quietly, "She came for company." Arthur nodded. The teacup was simply being polite. Toward the evening, a large four-wheel drive pulled into the lane. A sharply dressed gentleman stepped out. He looked at every table with practiced speed. "How much for this box?" Arthur glanced inside. Old letters, photographs, buttons. A child's knitted glove. 3 postcards tied together with ribbon. "I'm afraid that one's not for sale," Arthur said. The man frowned. "Why not?" Arthur looked into the box. "I haven't finished listening to it yet." The gentleman stared. "I don't understand." Arthur smiled. "I know you don't." The man walked away shaking his head, and after he'd gone, Nell asked, "Was there something valuable in that box?" Arthur looked almost puzzled. "Very." "What?" "The stories," he said. He picked up one of the postcards. "Money has never been the difficult part." "What is?" asked Nell. Arthur looked across the tables. "People tell one another to let go." Nell nodded. "They tell one another to forgive." "Yes," said Nell. "They tell one another to move on." He smiled sadly. "They rarely know what's attached." He placed the postcard back exactly where it had rested. "Sometimes people think they're sorting possessions," and he looked at Nell. "But they're actually sorting pieces of themselves." For a long while, neither of them spoke. A gentle breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle across the garden. The tables were noticeably emptier, not because things had been sold, because stories had begun travelling. Arthur looked around thoughtfully. "I think..." He smiled to himself. They were waiting. What was? The the stories. He watched Ben disappear through the gate, clutching his compass. "Not for buyers," Arthur said as he leaned and looked back towards the cottage. "For listeners." And somehow, standing there beneath the old apple tree, Nell realised that Edith had understood something extraordinary all those years ago. Arthur had never been collecting valuables. He had been preserving things other people had forgotten. Not forgotten because they were worthless. Forgotten because life had carried everyone onward. Arthur simply hadn't been very good at letting stories disappear. Arthur didn't notice the tears in Nell's eyes, or perhaps he did. He simply possessed a rare kindness of pretending not to. The afternoon drifted gently towards evening. Shadows stretched a little longer across the common. The last visitors wandered home, carrying parcels wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, each object beginning a new chapter in someone else's life. Arthur folded the tables slowly. There was no hurry. "There now," he said. "That's enough excitement for one day." Nell smiled. "You've enjoyed it?" "I have," Arthur said, "and I'm surprised." He looked around the garden. "I thought I'd feel as though I were losing things." "And?" Nell said. Arthur considered the question carefully. "I don't." He lifted an empty wooden crate. "I feel rather as though they've been introduced." The Tuesdays continued. Summer slowly leaned towards autumn. The leaves on the silver birches began carrying the first hints of gold. The common changed almost imperceptibly, yet somehow completely. Nell often thought that the common and Arthur were remarkably alike. Both appeared untidy to those who hurried through. Both revealed extraordinary order to those willing to linger. Both quietly preserved the footsteps of countless ordinary lives. On Tuesday, she arrived to find Arthur sitting alone at the kitchen table. He wasn't sorting, he wasn't reading. He was simply looking at Edith's little folded note. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous," Nell replied. "It usually is," Arthur smiled. "I've spent 70 years believing I collected things." Nell waited. "Never questioned it," he said, and he turned the note over in his fingers. "Funny, isn't it?" "What is?" Nell said. "You can spend a lifetime answering the wrong question." Outside the window, a pair of blackbirds landed beneath the apple tree. Arthur watched them for a while. "I always thought the question was," he glanced around the room, "why did I keep all this?" "And now?" Nell asked. I think Edith knew the real question. He looked at Nell. "Who was I keeping it for?" The room fell wonderfully quiet. Nell realised she had never once heard Arthur speak about himself. Every story began with someone else. George, Mary, Albert, Elsie, Emily, Harold, Mrs. Evans. The objects had always been introductions. Arthur himself had remained hidden somewhere among them. Perhaps Edith had known that. Perhaps that was why she had written the note. Not to help Arthur sort out his belongings, but to help Arthur discover himself. A week later, Nell opened a small drawer beneath the writing bureau. Inside lay nothing of value. A button, the odd postage stamp, a smooth pebble, a dried acorn, tiny toy soldier missing one arm. She looked up. "This one really is miscellaneous," Arthur laughed. It certainly is, said Nell. What connects them? He thought for a moment. Me, he said. She waited. When I was younger, I thought collections had to make sense. He picked up the little pebble. Then I realised life doesn't, he smiled. Life is simply a random assortment of what-ifs. Nell rolled the little pebble in her hand. What if I'd met someone different? What if I'd taken another job? What if I'd never crossed the common that day? Arthur nodded. We all carry drawers like this, he said, and he looked thoughtfully around the room. Some people hide theirs better. One rainy afternoon, the village vicar stopped by, and he wandered slowly around the cottage before saying, I've often wondered something. Arthur smiled. So have I. The vicar laughed. No, I mean, he gestured towards the shelves. Weren't you ever afraid people would laugh? Arthur looked genuinely puzzled. They did. You mean they did? Really? I mean, the vicar said, because of all this. Arthur followed his gaze. No, he smiled kindly. No, why not? Arthur thought for a long while before answering. Because I wasn't collecting things for them. The vicar nodded slowly. I suppose not. Arthur rested one hand upon the nearest shelf. One person's junk is another person's treasure, he smiled. But I've discovered something else. One person's memory is another person's mystery. The vicar stood quietly for several moments. I've never thought of it that way. Arthur chuckled. Neither had I. As autumn settled properly across the common, the cottage grew lighter. Not emptier, lighter. Shelves began appearing. Corners emerged that Nell had never noticed before. Sunlight reached places it hadn't touched for years. Arthur would occasionally stop in the middle of a room looking almost surprised. I'd forgotten there was a window there, Nell laughed. I was beginning to wonder, Arthur said as he smiled. I think the room's been waiting to breathe. So have you. Arthur looked at her. I expect you're right. The final gathering took place one of those perfect October afternoons that England occasionally produces without warning. The sky was impossibly blue. The air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. Children chased one another across the edge of the common. The apple tree dropped the occasional fruit with a gentle thud. People came and went all day. Not as strangers anymore, but friends. Mrs. Collins arrived carrying photographs of the enamel jug sitting proudly on her kitchen dresser. Little Ben returned with his compass around his neck. It's still pointing north, he said. Arthur smiled. So am I. The lonely widow brought some homemade scones. The retired auctioneer returned carrying George's lantern. I thought you'd like to know, he said. Arthur looked worried. Is something wrong? Oh, no, the gentleman smiled. It sits in my hallway now. He hesitated. And my grandchildren know who George Henshaw was. Arthur looked away for a moment. When he turned back, his eyes were brighter than before. I'm very pleased, he said. After everyone had gone, silence settled once more over the cottage. Not the silence of loneliness, the silence of completion. Arthur stood in the middle of the room. There were still shelves, still drawers, still photographs and still stories, but there was also some space. He looked slowly around the room and then toward the common beyond the window. Finally, he spoke. I understand. Nell didn't ask what he meant because she already knew. Arthur smiled, the gentle smile of a man who had stopped searching for an answer because he had quietly found it. I always believed I was preserving things, he said, as he shook his head softly. I wasn't. What then? Asked Nell. I was preserving people. He looked at Edith's note, folded, resting quietly beside the teapot. She knew before I did. For a few moments they stood together in silence, and then Arthur said the words that would remain with Nell for the rest of her life. Funny thing, he said. You spend years trying to understand life while you're living it. He smiled. It doesn't work. No, said Nell. He looked out across the common where generations had walked before either of them had been born. I think life is understood backwards. His eyes rested on the old paths disappearing into the even light, but lived forwards. Nell felt the truth of those words and let them settle somewhere deep inside her. She thought of Edith, of Arthur, of every object that had found its way into another pair of hands, of every story that had refused to disappear, of her own life, the parts she had questioned, the parts she had misunderstood, the parts that only now, looking back, finally made sense. Not because they had changed, but because she could finally see them. As Nell walked home across the common that evening, the bracken whispered in the fading light. The silver birches shimmered. Ancient oaks stood exactly where they always had. The old paths carried her home just as they had carried generations before her. The common remembered all of them. Arthur had remembered them too. Nell finally understood what Edith had wanted her to see. The treasure had never been hidden in Arthur's cottage. It had been hidden in the ordinary lives that passed quietly through it, and sometimes the greatest treasures spend years pretending to be nothing more than an old photograph, a cracked teacup, a broken watch, or a tiny folded note tucked into the back of an old drawer, patiently waiting for someone who knows how to listen. Arthur was quiet for a long while. He looked around the room as though he was seeing it for the first time. Shelves were still full. Boxes were still stacked against the walls. Nothing had changed really, and yet something had. I always thought I was buying old things, he said at last. Nell smiled. I don't think you ever were. He looked at her questioningly. I think people came here because they trusted you. Arthur gave a gentle laugh. They came because I paid a fair price. No, said Nell softly. They stayed because you listened. And the room became still again. Arthur thought of the widow who had cried over a cracked teapot before finally leaving it behind. He remembered the young man who had sold his father's fishing tackle but stayed for another hour telling stories about the Sunday mornings by the river. There had been hundreds of stories like this over the years, and he remembered every story. He had simply never realised that that was the most important part. Nell reached for the little folded note Edith had left all those years before. If he's still there, she read quietly, go and see Arthur. He never understood what he was collecting. Arthur looked at the tiny piece of paper for a very long time. I thought she meant antiques. So did I, Nell replied. What did she mean? Nell folded the note carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. I think she meant moments. Arthur frowned. Every person who walked through this door left lighter than when they arrived. They thought they were leaving a watch, or a photograph, or a biscuit tin. What they were really leaving was a story with someone they trusted would understand it. Arthur lowered his eyes. For the first time, he understood why people so often lingered after a sale had been agreed. They had never come simply to sell. They had come to say goodbye. Nell looked around at the shelves that reached almost to the ceiling. You have spent a lifetime helping other people let go, Arthur. He followed her gaze, and now she smiled. Perhaps it's time to let a few of these continue their journey, Nell said. He looked at the nearest shelf. For years he had believed that keeping everything safe meant keeping everything close. Now he wasn't so sure. He picked up an old brass compass and turned it over in his hands. I know exactly who bought me this, he said with a smile. Captain Lewis. He insisted he'd only sailed to France twice, though I heard 3 different versions of the story. Nell laughed. You see, the story isn't in the compass anymore, is it? Arthur nodded slowly. It's here, he replied as he touched his chest, almost absent-mindedly. This compass could now find another owner, because the story had already found its home. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched across the common, following the same ancient path that countless feet had worn through the bracken over hundreds of years. Nothing stayed exactly where it had always been. Not people, not possessions, not even memories. Perhaps that was how it was meant to be. Arthur stood and looked around his crowded little house. And for the first time in many years, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a beginning. As Nell reached the garden gate, she looked back. Arthur was already carrying one small box towards his front room, not to hide it away, but to place it by the door ready for its next story. Much later, as she walked home across the common, Nell found herself thinking something she had heard years before. Life is understood backwards. Only when Arthur looked back and could finally understand why he had spent a lifetime listening. But now he needed to live forwards. Tomorrow he would begin again, not by collecting more, but by helping a few treasured things and the people who loved them continue their journey. That did seem rather a long story, but I'd like to let you know that it came about because of a very, very true story. Very recently, somebody in my family came across the same type of thing, a collection of objects that had been collected for, 70 years or more. Some had been buried in the garden. Some was piled in rooms to the roof. Boxes damp. House so full, like a hoarder, that even the ceiling couldn't be seen. And so slowly the person died. The person died, unfortunately, right amongst all those things. And now was the time to sort them out for the family, or what was left of the family. We thought it was heartbreaking because when the stuff was cleaned up, it was obvious everything had a story. I don't know how, why, what or where. It was a complete and utter muddle. different things, glass, old Bibles, religious artifacts, you name it, it was around somewhere. In fact, it started last autumn. This turnout, we are now 6-7 months later, and it's still going. Stuff is still found in rooms and buildings that nobody ever knew were there. So trying to make sense of this, because it's so sad that someone lived their life buried in possessions that all had a meaning. So that's where this came from, and I really hope you enjoyed it, and do remember that saying that we live lives backwards. We really do. We live in that past. We live in the stuff that happened. I have realised that looking at this and writing this story, that now we need to realise everything that happened before and start living life forwards, because we deserve to. Till the next time, when you are cordially invited to join me on another story.